It's great to be here. Thanks for this really inspiring meeting today. So my name is Noa Herz. My research centers around understanding the neural basis of episodic memory. And I'm specifically interested in cases where memory fails and trying to understand something about how the memory system usually works from these cases. So as humans, we have this remarkable ability to travel back in time and relive our past experiences. Think, for example, about your last birthday party. You might be able to recall specific details, such as the cake that was served. And together with these details, the whole context of that event will probably come to mind. A long line of research has suggested that the hippocampus is specifically involved in this binding of items to the context in which they were originally encoded. We all know that our memories are many times accurate, but that's not always the case. And when thinking back about my last birthday party, I might be actually recalling a cake that was actually served on a completely different occasion. Now, if the hippocampus indeed stores the association of items with their originally encoded context, it makes sense to think that by looking at hippocampal activity, we might be able to differentiate between cases of correct and false recalls. So that was the first research question that we asked. We wanted to know whether hippocampal activity at the moments just preceding memory retrieval can reliably differentiate correct from false memories. And this is interesting not only from a scientific perspective, but also from a clinical perspective, because in some cases, falsely recalling a certain detail might be detrimental to mental health. And that might happen, for example, in post-traumatic stress disorder, where somebody can think about the traumatic incident under context that is actually safe and dissimilar to the originally encoded context. So the way we approached this question was using intracranial recordings collected from epilepsy patients undergoing seizure monitoring at the hospital. So while patients are there with electrodes in their brains, we simply approach them and ask them to take part in our memory experiment. The basic design is a free recall task where patients are seeing a list of words and are subsequently requested to say as many words that they can remember from the preceding list. Many times they are able to say a correct item, but sometimes they tend to have an intrusion. Intrusion is a false recall of an item that was either never presented in the experiment or an item that was actually presented, but not in the preceding list because they see multiple lists throughout the task. And again, we take the time window just prior to the beginning of vocalization and looking at the hippocampal signal in that time window. We observe a very consistent neural pattern reflective of correct recalls in comparison to intrusions. I'm calling this a spectral tag effect. It's a tag because we see an increased theta, decreased alpha, and increased gamma for correct recalls in comparison to false recalls that you see here in green. And this data was collected on 101 participants with hippocampal coverage. We were then able to replicate this effect in a different data set, this time of items that are semantically categorized, but again, showing a very similar neural pattern of correct recalls in comparison to intrusions. So that was great. That means that we can see this consistent pattern that is reliable and generalizable across participants and study conditions. We were also able to show that high frequency and low frequency activity in the hippocampus that differentiate correct from false recalls is time specific. And specifically what I'm showing you here is from 2 seconds before and until 2 seconds after the beginning of vocalization. The difference between correct recalls and intrusions emerge just prior to the beginning of vocalization and fades rapidly afterwards. So what this means is that high frequency and low frequency activity in the hippocampus seems to be driving the retrieval process rather than reflecting a more general brain state. The very last thing I would like to show you is that it doesn't make much sense to think about the hippocampus as a truth detection machine. It's not like the hippocampus just differentiate correct from false recalls. It makes much more sense to think about the hippocampus as storing the associative strength between items and the context in which they were originally encoded. And if that's correct, then we should expect to find differences between types of false recalls that share either high or low semantic similarity or contextual similarity with the initially encoded context. And that's indeed what we found. So specifically for low frequency activity in the hippocampus, we found that low frequency activity gradually decreased as a function of the similarity of the intrusion to the correct context. In this case, I'm differentiating between intrusions that were taken from a prior list in the experiment in comparison to intrusions that were never presented in the experiment at all. And we showed a very similar thing in the categorized experiment, in which we can differentiate between either intrusions that are semantically associated with the preceding list or intrusions that share no semantic association to the preceding list, again showing that low frequency activity in the hippocampus decrease as a function of the similarity between the intrusion and the target context. By that, I'll summarize. So what we've shown is that hippocampal activity at the moments leading to memory retrieval can differentiate and actually predict whether a correct or a false recall is about to happen. I showed you that high frequency activity differentiate between correct and false recalls, but that's regardless of the false recall type. And contrary to that, low frequency activity in the hippocampus differentiate between correct and false recalls, but is also sensitive to the degree of similarity between the item and the target context. So by showing that hippocampal low frequency activity is sensitive to the association between items and context, we suggest that it actually reflects our ability to retrieve memories that are bound to a specific context. So by that, I'll say thank you to my advisor, Professor Michael Kahana, and to the lab members, and thank you all for listening.
Yes, thank you, Noa. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Siri.
Thanks very much. So this is obviously, again, something you've been working on for quite a while, huh? It's like, so how many years of work is this?
So this is the main project for my postdoc. So I would say more than 2 years, probably almost 3 years.
Yeah, because you definitely had like some real sort of power moves in there. It's like everyone understands that if you recordings from 100, like intracranial recordings from 100 patients, it's like, whoa, that's really cool.
I didn't collect the data. I just analyzed it.
So I wondered how you tested it. Like, what was the task? Because I think you gave a lot of details on a lot of the other stuff, but I was left wondering.
The memory task?
Yeah, what were people actually asked to do?
So it's a free recall task. They simply see a list of items that are presented one after the other. And we then ask them to simply recall as many items as they can remember from the preceding list in any order. So that's the task.
Right, so it's free but prompted recall.
It's prompted just by the fact that we ask them to say words only from the preceding list, but they do not see any cue on the screen. So in that sense, it's a spontaneously generated retrieval process.
So how do you explain this at parties?
I never explained it at parties. You mean how would I try to explain this in a more accessible way to someone who's not from the field?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I guess one of the things that I would try to think about is how to make this interesting for someone who's not from the memory field. I think it's interesting to think about the fact that, people are saying, and many times saying something that they think is correct. Like in that case, patients are trying to recall items that were actually presented to them in the preceding list, but they do mistakes. They make errors, and I think it's interesting to think about the fact that by looking into brain activity, we can actually differentiate between correct and false recalls, even though this information is at that time somehow not accessible, right, to people. So I find that something that is might be interesting for people that are not from this field.
Cool. I'm going to leave Rowan.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up exactly on that point, Siri, that we've been talking about this all day about, how do you pitch a 5-minute talk? And typically it revolves around, well, what is the one key takeaway? And I think the idea of what would you tell your granny, what would you tell at a party is the best way to start, because that's what people are going to remember, even if they're in the field, even if they're at an academic conference and have their, game face on. We only remember what is fun, what is, easy to take away, easy to tell again, right? We like to remember things so that we can tell other people about them. And if we can't tell our husband or our granny or tell somebody at a party, we're less likely to remember it ourselves. So I think it's a really good starting point is to think like, what is the one thing I would tell at a party about it? And I think you did such a good job laying those crumbs that I was talking about a few minutes ago. Giving people just a couple pictures that help them to find their way into what is a huge amount of work and a big research field. But I think by Siri prompting you with that question, you go, well, actually, all you really want people to know about is false memories. Cut through, everything about context and items, about birthday cake, like just cut straight through it and go, sometimes we remember things wrong. Do you remember that time when, oh, actually, that never happened? And you can come up with a funny anecdote and you know what, that's sort of when I mentioned Lorimer, I think that's he made it super personal and he made it so easy for you to go, oh, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I know exactly why this is impactful. I know exactly what you're going to tell me about today. And because they're in that position of certainty, when people start seeing words that they don't understand and pictures of devices that look scary, and yours really look pretty scary, they go, oh my goodness, I don't know if I'm going to understand all of this, which I definitely also did. It puts you off. Whereas I've been in that situation. I misremember if my husband did anything ever all the time. False memories are something we can all connect with. So I think the minute you thought in that way, you got straight to the crux of what you want people to take, at least I think what you wanted people to take away. So I think Siri's prompt is super usable. We should maybe all use that.
But I do also just want to mention that when Merle was thinking about, the best talk ever by a former colleague, Lorimer, mostly, he is also probably, he's definitely in the top 5 most charismatic people you will ever meet in your whole life. So it's nice to, look to those people to get inspiration, but, I think the main message I think from us should be that you did a really good job. You came across super professional, very confident, and your presentation was was clear and seemed really well prepared.
I definitely can be fully transparent and say, as you were speaking, I was sending a message to Eleanor saying she is amazing. I don't know what I'm going to say in the comment section. So you hit it out of the park. You really did. These comments are just coming from a good place where, we just want everybody to do the best that they can. I thought you were super charismatic. You came across super confident and your work speaks for itself. But I do think the one thing we can all try to do better is, communicate our science. The people not only fund us, but people get excited about it. We need people to be engaged in science. We need our partners to believe in us and go, oh, you do really cool stuff. We need our kids to understand what we do. I think, only positive feedback for you today, Noa. Thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you so much. It's really valuable to get some feedback about the work. Thank you.